So we're going to talk about everything in the next 45 minutes. So I'm really looking forward to Dennis's very concise and smart answers so I can get through all my zillion questions. But I just kind of wanted to start with a personal question, Dennis, which is, why did you get into this field? Like, what drew you into this world? I mean, life wasn't tough enough. You had to go into politics. So tell me a little bit about.
You know, I was turn this on. I was a child in the 1960s, basically, and I was I would say I was politicized by the Kennedys. More Robert Kennedy, because I was a little too young for John Kennedy, but I actually worked in the Robert Kennedy campaign. I had the sense that you had a duty and an obligation to do something in public service. And then Vietnam, I think, did a lot to energize me, but it was really sort of the 1967 war, which was a galvanizing event for me. On the one hand, I wasn't a pacifist, although I thought Vietnam was wrong, but I thought it was wrong because it basically diverted us from an area where we actually had a real interest, which was in the Middle East and with Israel. And so I got, in a sense, I got motivated by that. I became convinced that I had a responsibility to try to affect policy. I wanted to try to do so, and it was really that drew me into it more than anything else.
So because you've worked so intensely on the U.S.-Israel relationship, and here we are at the Pesach holiday, I wanted also to just preface our conversation with asking you how to describe for us your relationship to Judaism.
You know, I grew up in a kind of non-religious household. I think a-religious would be the best way to describe it. I grew up in Marin County, just across the Golden Gate Bridge. When I first, Marin County at that time was literally a non-Jewish place. My high school, my grammar school was elementary to 8th grade. There were, I think, 3 Jews in the whole school. In my high school, there were maybe 4. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. It wasn't directed towards me because I was a pretty good athlete and somehow it was never personalized, but I would hear it nonetheless. And it made me, I had a sense that I was Jewish, but it was not in a religious sense, it was more in a cultural sense. But I lived in an area that was completely, there just wasn't a Jewish presence. Marin County changes in terms of its demographics a little later on. There's more of a Jewish presence today than there was when I was growing up. When I went to UCLA as an undergraduate, and I became more aware of being Jewish, because at that time about 35% of the student body was Jewish. But I really developed much more of an identity when I got married, because my wife Debbie had grown up in a more religious household, and when we joined a shul, when we began to have kids, and my rabbi, his name is Jonathan Maltzman, is an amazing pulpit rabbi. And when I was our negotiator under Clinton, I began, when I wasn't in the region, every Saturday morning I would go to shul. And the reason was that, A, it gave me a space. It was the one time during the week where no one could get me. It was the one time when I had a kind of space for myself, but because his Devar Torahs were so thought-provoking, they also gave me a perspective outside of what I was doing. So I couldn't get consumed or lost in what I was doing. And literally, I mean, everybody knew at the White House, the one time you don't get him is Saturday morning. And so, I mean, that, it produced, I came to the real understanding of Shabbat in a very indirect way.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that gives a nice context for us and transition into what we're going to talk about next, which is the Middle East. We promised everyone we would talk about the Middle East today. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what is the biggest threat in the Middle East? What can the U.S. do, if anything, to resolve that problem? And how is Israel affected by that issue?
You know, if I were to ask you and everybody here, what do you think President Obama's most important objective in the Middle East for the remaining time he has in office, I could probably do a survey and I would get different answers. He would say ISIS, countering ISIS. And I would say that's a legitimate issue to be preoccupied with, because ISIS is different than other radical Islamists that we've seen in the past, not in terms of their totalitarian approach to life, not in terms of their fundamental intolerance, not in terms of their belief that Israel shouldn't exist, but in terms of the fact that they are apocalyptic and they believe they have a responsibility to produce the apocalypse. They actually have an online magazine called Dabiq, which refers to a town in northern Syria, which is where this, according to theology, is where the cataclysmic battle to cleanse everything should take place. So even if you don't believe that, let's say you don't feel like we should be engaged in the Middle East, the fact is, if we did nothing there, it's like when Rand Paul was running, he said, look, if we didn't attack them, they won't attack us. Wrong. You know, the fact is, as long as we exist, they're going to attack us. So you don't have the luxury. The Las Vegas rules don't apply to the Middle East generally, and certainly not to ISIS. You know, Las Vegas rules are what takes place there stays there. In the Middle East, what takes place in the Middle East doesn't stay there. So I would say ISIS is what President Obama would identify as the most important objective. I would say that is an important objective, but I would put Iran on top of that for a reason. It isn't that I think that Iran is about to attack us the same way ISIS has a desire and a kind of a strategic imperative to attack us. The difference is that you cannot defeat, much less discredit ISIS unless you have the Sunnis, the Sunni Arab states, the Sunni Arab leaders. They don't join us, they don't view ISIS as their main threat, they view Iran as their main threat. So if we don't put Iran as our main preoccupation, we won't have an effective strategy against ISIS. To defeat ISIS, you need the Sunnis to provide people on the ground, and you need the Sunnis to basically replace ISIS after you have defeated them. If we roll them out of Mosul, there's two big symbolic achievements they have. Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria, which creates basically their capital. If we roll them out of there, and we don't have anybody to replace them with, then we're going to get son of ISIS. ISIS itself, the successor to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who we defeated in 2007, 2008. There were 100,000 Sunnis who were part of what was known as the Sahwa, which means awakening. They were part of the awakening councils. We made all sorts of promises to them. We paid them. They were supposed to be integrated into the Iraqi security forces. The promises we made to them were betrayed. They were then, in a sense, disenfranchised by Maliki, and it's the combination of Maliki and Assad in Syria produced ISIS. So if we don't have the Sunnis to replace them, both on the ground and with governance, we will get son of ISIS. So my not-so-short answer to your question is, for me, President Obama is right that ISIS needs to be a priority, but the reason he can't succeed in the strategy against ISIS is because he won't get the Sunnis to join him. If we want the Sunnis to join us, and we need them, we have to have a strategy that focuses on countering Iran in the region, especially their use of Shia militias.
Okay, good. I'm glad maybe you could go into a little more detail, because if I were Obama sitting here across from you, I might say I just took this momentous step of signing this accord with the Iranians, and so I am dealing with that threat, or it is being dealt with, and perhaps we may have to discuss this again and whatever the timeline is for when it expires. So was that what's your view on the Iran deal? Obviously, it was a splintering issue in the American Jewish community. So I'd like to hear your take on it and why, if you think it's going to be effective or not.
So the question's a good question. How do the Arab states view the Iran deal? Because, in fact, if they viewed it so favorably, they would have seen that as helping to counter the Iranians. But they don't view it as helping to counter the Iranians. They view the sanctions relief as providing more resources to Iran to actually threaten them. Again, we could deal with that if we were more active in terms of countering what the Iranians are doing with all the Shia militias. In Syria today, you have Hezbollah. Everybody's heard about Hezbollah. Hezbollah has over 7,000 forces in Syria today. They probably have lost close to 1,000 of their fighters. One of the reasons Hezbollah doesn't represent much of an immediate threat to Israel today is because they're consumed within Lebanon. But there actually are Shia militias from as far away as Afghanistan, who the Iranians have imported into Syria. The focal point of these Sunni Arab states is, what is Iran doing throughout the rest of the region? So the Iran deal didn't solve that problem. In the eyes of these Arab states, it actually helped to promote that problem. How do I look at the Iran deal? I viewed it as a mixed package. It won't surprise you, since I spent 3 years in the Obama administration, that the White House and the President himself badly wanted me to come out in support of the deal, and I did not. I did not mainly because there were areas of vulnerability. As I said, I didn't come out in favor of it. I didn't come out against it. There were positive elements. This is a deal that, if it's enforced, for real buys you 15 years. That Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. It blocks 3 different pathways to a nuclear weapon. There's an enrichment pathway, there's a plutonium separation pathway, and there's a covert pathway. And it blocks each of those for 15 years because the Iranians are limited to less than 1 bomb's worth of material for 15 years. They had to reduce what was 10 to 12 bombs worth of enriched material to less than 1 bomb's worth of material, and all that was done. It was shipped out of the country. They had to commit to no reprocessing capabilities for plutonium. You can't build a plutonium-based bomb if you don't have reprocessing capabilities. A reprocessing capability is a big plant, something that you can't hide. And then for at least 20 years, the whole supply chain, from where you mine uranium, from where you mill it and turn it into yellow cake, from where you take that yellow cake and convert it into a gas called hexafluoride, when you take that converted gas and feed it into a centrifuge, every one of those steps in that link in that chain is monitored on a 24/7 basis. So if you can't covertly divert materials away, you can't covertly build a bomb. So basically, for 15 years, you really are limiting them. So that might sound like I should come out and say, okay, that's a good deal. Why don't I support it? Well, the reason I didn't support it is because after 15 years, there's no limitation whatsoever. Iran gets treated as if they are Japan or the Netherlands. And they ain't Japan or the Netherlands. Now, you could bet and hope that they'll change in 15 years, but policies aren't based on a hope that something will turn out that way. You need to have an insurance policy.
Do you think that's what Obama is hoping for? That
Yes,
there is going to be some kind of groundswell of change that will change the sort of political calculus in Iran?
Both he and some of the closest people around him have gone out of their way to say this was a transaction, not a transformational deal. But their hope was it would build the pragmatists within Iran. And by the way, I can't say to you categorically that there's no possibility of that, because the truth is, if Iran gets integrated into the international financial community, that pragmatic wing might gain more of a stake in never again adopting policies that would put that at risk. The problem is, in the near term, there's no chance of it, because the Supreme Leader, and I said this before, actually I said it to the President, in the near term, the Supreme Leader is going to have to compensate for having supported this deal, basically having allowed this deal to go through. The Supreme Leader will compensate with the Revolutionary Guard because they were against it. The Supreme Leader will want to show that his ideology of resistance and his hostility towards us hasn't been changed whatsoever. So he'll have to go out of his way. By the way, every single statement he's made since the deal, every single one has been worse about us. So if you look at what they're doing internally, more people are being hanged. More newspapers are being shut down. More journalists are being put in jail. Anybody who has even a reformist kind of connection is under threat. The recent elections to the parliament, it was ironic that the newspapers portrayed this as a win for Rouhani. And the reason they did it is because all the hardliners who were running basically were voted against. Those who were identified as being Rouhani opponents. But all of those who were identified as being reform or even moderate were disqualified from being allowed to be candidates. So the interpretation was, because those who were running, who were seen as being opponents of Rouhani, were defeated, that meant that more moderate types won. There was a list called the List of Hope, and many of the leaders on that list were among very hardline types. So you are not seeing an increase at this point domestically in terms of a move towards greater pragmatism or moderation. And you weren't going to. Now, that doesn't mean, as I said, that it can't happen over time. But you can't bet on that. You can't assume that. And so I had 6 conditions, which if people want me to go through them, I will, but I had 6 conditions which were not met. And none of them required a renegotiation of the deal. But what they required was, what they provided is addressing what I see as being the main vulnerability. You have to bolster deterrence. The Iranians have to know that if they cheat on this, the price is going to be intolerable, as they measure the price, not as we do it.
So in other words, you're totally optimistic about the future of Iran. So how many of you saw Jeffrey Goldberg's Atlantic cover story, The Obama Doctrine, that came out last month, in which he did an extensive interview with President Obama on his foreign policy? I wanted to ask you, Dennis, first of all, do you agree with Obama's assumption that Americans are tired of intervention?
Well, I think there is a fatigue. I think there is a wariness and a weariness about getting sucked into Middle East conflicts, and it's understandable. But I'll also note something for you. When 2 Americans were beheaded by ISIS, 94% of the public was aware of those beheadings. There isn't any other issue on the planet that 94% of the public would be aware of. And it was interesting, in the immediate aftermath of that, that's when the president began to carry out strikes against ISIS.
By the way, I just have to add, one of those journalists who was beheaded was a childhood friend of mine who I went to Jewish day school with, Stephen Sotloff, which I wrote about. So I in particular felt the reverberative effects of that. It was, yeah.
Well, I mean, it says a lot about ISIS, but it also says something about, I think, the American public as well, that if they perceive a threat, then they'll be supportive. Another indication that I think that that's true. President Obama right now has the highest approval ratings he's had, basically since early in his administration. 53%. 53% approval rating, but on foreign policy, it's 37%. And that says something. There is a perception that what he is doing in foreign policy, fairly or not, is not making us safer. And if it's being driven by his assumption that the public won't support the kind of engagement or intervention, then it's, I think, again, it may be a misreading. One last point. If you set up an equation that the only choice we have is you got to put thousands of troops on the ground or you do nothing, well, the choice will always be do nothing. But there's a lot of options in between. And it's up to whoever is the president to frame those options in a way that explains the relationship between what we're doing and the threats we see and how this is going to address those threats.
So for those who didn't read the article, Obama very explicitly stated that he more or less feels that the Middle East conflicts are intractable and it's a better investment of American treasure resources, time, and energy to invest in countries like Southeast Asia and in African countries, because these are people who want a better life for their children and they're interested in education and they want better jobs, and he feels that there are too many complicated factors in the Middle East and too much conflict that it's like, he was basically saying, like, I'd rather just stay away. So I wanted to ask you, where do you think he, especially considering the statistic you just offered about his approval rating in foreign policy, what did he get right in the Middle East and what did he get very wrong? And also, did you learn anything from the Jeffrey Goldberg article that you didn't already know? Did it shed light on anything for you?
So let me start with that, and then I'll come back to the other question. I think what it mostly revealed was a president who is deciding that even before he leaves office, he's going to frame the narrative about what he's done and why he did it. I think it reflected more than anything else a kind of probably anger and frustration on his part with how he's been portrayed, and he was going to tell his story, and he did. I mean, I guess if you ask me, I was surprised by the timing, because he said things in there that affects his ability to perform. Look, a week ago he went to Saudi Arabia for a summit. Now, in the Jeffrey Goldberg piece, he refers to the Saudis, not only the Saudis, but as being free riders. And he also suggested that they should share the Middle East with the Iranians. Now, if you were really thinking about, gee, I've got to be conducting a lot of business with these guys between now and the end of my term, these are not the kind of things that you would have been saying. So I was a little surprised by that. Excuse me. I was also surprised by he identified his not acting on the red line as a badge of moral courage. Excuse me. And I found that surprising. If he had said making that decision was a really difficult one for me, because I understood it was going to affect our credibility and how America's word was going to be perceived. But I made the call because I thought acting was going to leave us worse off. I would have understood that. Because then it was a kind of dilemma. But by explaining that this was an act of moral courage at a time when Syria represents a humanitarian catastrophe, I found it an extraordinary thing for him to say. And it was the most troubling thing for me about the interview. In terms of what he got most wrong, Syria, he got most wrong. Because he looked at Syria and he saw Iraq. And he adopted a policy largely of avoidance or containment, and it produced a humanitarian catastrophe, the rise of ISIS, a refugee crisis that is basically threatened the bindings that hold the European Union together. That he got most wrong. I think what he got most right in the Middle East was, in a sense, we can't solve all the problems. Now, in a sense, it may sound like this is a bit of a contradiction. This brings me back to what I was saying. We need to have a level of humility about what we can do and what we can't do. That he kind of got. But he translated that into, gee, if we can't solve it, we do nothing. And that, fundamentally, I think is the biggest single mistake. You know, when it comes to the Israelis and Palestinians, your choices aren't, we either solve it or we do nothing. When it came to Syria the choices couldn't be, gee, we either put thousands of troops in there or we do nothing. In each case, when you set up the equation that way, you do nothing. And in the Middle East, what that does is it creates vacuums. And when you create vacuums in the Middle East, the worst forces fill it.
Do you think that the Middle East matters as much as it used to?
Obviously, when we have a reality where we are increasingly energy independent, we're not in the same position towards the region as we might have been in the past. The problem is, if you think that allows us to avoid the Middle East, it ignores a couple of realities, even economically. There's one pool of energy worldwide. So if everything gets disrupted in the Middle East, and suddenly 20% of the energy that's available worldwide is lost, what do you think happens? The price of oil, anyway, gets bid up dramatically. Your allies are suffering significantly from it economically. We can't be insulated because the price is going to affect us. The global economy is going to be affected. So it's not like, even if we aren't as dependent, that we somehow can say, okay, we don't need to care about it. That's number one. Number two, I start off by saying the Las Vegas rules don't apply. What takes place in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. Right. So we don't have the luxury of somehow sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing. The challenge, maybe I can encapsulate it this way. In Iraq, with what Bush did, we replaced the regime and we had absolutely no plan for what came afterwards. So we created a vacuum, and the worst thing happened. So we overdid it, which is an understatement to say we overdid it. In Syria, we didn't, it was the forces from within Syria that created this conflict. We didn't create the conflict. But we didn't do anything when there, in fact, was a secular opposition that was begging for assistance, and we gave them nothing. And the only ones who got money and arms were the Islamists. We contributed to a vacuum there, and the worst part is filled it. So we overdid it one place, we underdid it another place. What we're looking for is a Goldilocks solution in the Middle East. When you have a threat, you got to figure out what's the stake we have? What are the means we have available? Who else could play a role there? What do we need to do to get them to play that role? I mean, it's a mix of understanding the nature of the threat, what your objectives are, the means you have at your disposal, who can play a role in that, and how we can influence them to play that role. This administration, look, unfortunately, the last two administrations haven't done it well. We have to hope that the next administration does it better.
So I want to address the elephant in the room, which is Islamist extremism. And I want to ask you, do you think it's possible to combat this scourge, and how? I mean, what can America really do to stem the tide of this, what at least appears to be a growing threat in the Middle East?
Well, the first thing is don't deny it exists. Don't be reluctant to call it what it is. You don't impress anybody.
But does that go back to what you said earlier about this idea that it was more important to curry favor in the Arab world, so let's not offend them?
I think it goes back to when the administration came in, when Obama came in, and this is not unique to him. Every administration, every president comes in and has a way of sort of being the opposite of his predecessor. Look, when George W. Bush came in, his initial policy was what I called ABC, anything but Clinton. And when Obama came in, it was anything but Bush, ABB. Now, in Obama's case, he felt that Bush had created an image, I think unfairly, but nonetheless, there was a perception, and Obama was right, there was a perception that Bush was at war with Islam. And so Obama was going to show we're not at war with Islam. And so that meant you could never, somehow, you couldn't use words like Islamofascism. You couldn't say radical Islamists. You couldn't use terms that actually describe who these groups were. Well, those in the Middle East who were facing them, they knew who they were. Right. They weren't defensive about calling them radical Islamists. The most amazing thing is to find they will use those terms. But there's this hesitancy that somehow, we'll be offensive if we do that. We'll lose our natural partners. So the first thing is, call it what it is. The second thing is, you do have to produce setbacks. Look, the key to ISIS claims to have a divine mandate. Now, if you have a divine mandate and you're constantly losing all the time, sooner or later it becomes hard to claim you have a divine mandate. So you have to set them back. But the kind of setbacks they've had so far, they can explain away. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed, well, he's not just self-proclaimed, he's the new caliph. He is, one of his messages was that Allah tests us, and He tests us with adversity. So when we have setbacks, that's just Allah testing us. So the proof of our faith is that we stick with it. Well, that's fine when you're losing Ramadi. It's not fine when you lose Mosul. It's not fine when you lose Raqqa. These were the symbols of your success that proved you have the divine mandate. So you have to set them back there, number one. Number two, we have to do a better job of using social media. We're using it to try to create arguments against them. We should be using it differently in two ways. One, we actually, especially the Kurds, have actually captured a fair number of ISIS fighters. Mm-hmm. Now, every ISIS fighter is supposed to, if there's not only a divine mandate, they're supposed to be divine messengers. So why don't we put on YouTube, why don't we put on social media when they surrender with their hands up? What kind of a divine messenger are you when you're surrendering? It betrays, supposedly, what you say you are. Same thing, we now have defectors. Put the defectors on social media. Let this go viral. And lastly, you got to bring in, you need the key Sunni tribes and Sunni states to join us. And that's where I started. Do enough against Iran to convince them that, we are in this together with them, so they will do more against ISIS. The combination of these three things, this is the way we will succeed over time.
So I want to move now to talk a little bit about the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's no secret that there has been a rocky relationship between our president and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I wanted to ask you, how, when you're looking back, because you said, I loved your lecture the other night when you tested the audience to say who was the worst president from Truman until now for Israel, and it was not Obama. And I think there are a handful of people in the Jewish community who believe that to be the case, whether or not it's factual. So when you look back at the last 7.5 years, what do you see? Was Obama good for Israel or bad for Israel?
It's a mixed picture. Look, on security, Obama was good. The fact is, he took the structure. I'll even tell you, just to give it one example, when we came in the Obama administration, the Bush administration had begun selling very significant arms to the Arab Gulf states in a way that was beginning to undercut Israel's qualitative military edge. We had early meetings with the Israelis on this. I was put in charge of creating a committee with the Israelis to figure out a way to address this. And we came up with a systematic way to address this. And Obama approved it. So here was a case where Bush, who actually was a friend of Israel, was doing something that, from an Israeli standpoint, was a problem. And so here's Obama who addresses it. Obama, during the war in Gaza in 2014, Israel began to run out of Iron Dome missiles. He automatically approves $250 million more to produce a whole new production line for Iron Dome missiles. At the same time he does it, the White House was criticizing some of what Israel was doing in terms of targeting. But he never made it a condition. So on security, I still have that cough. On security, he was good. But on everything else, he had no problem creating a public dissidence. He saw it, as I say in the Obama chapter, he saw it as a way of drawing a distance from Israel that would convince the Arabs or Muslims that in a way that would be good for our relationship with them. He was in that tradition of those leaders, those presidents, who believed that when you distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. And that was wrong. One other point, he looked at the Palestinians as being weak. He looked at the Israelis as being strong. He put all the onus on the Israelis and nothing on the Palestinians. And I used to say, this is a problem, not simply because of the Israelis, this is a problem for the Palestinians. The Palestinians have a political culture that makes any kind of compromise illegitimate. Their own sense of their history, their deep sense of grievance, their own feeling about the injustices that have been done to them, they've made being a victim a strategy. Now, when you never hold them accountable, we made offers to the Palestinians. In March of 2014, Obama made a proposal to the Palestinians that addressed all the core issues of the conflict. It went beyond what had been worked out with the Israelis. And I knew a lot about this because even though I'd left the administration, I was running a back channel between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And basically, we had produced a lot of what was then being discussed. And when the president made this proposal to Abu Mazen, he asked for a response and he never got one. And you would have never known that, right? Because there was no criticism of the Palestinians. As I said, if you want the Palestinians at some point to be responsible, they have to know there's a cost when they're not responsible. If you constantly give the Palestinians a pass, and unfortunately that's what this administration did, if you constantly give them a pass, they will never do what's hard for them. Making a compromise is excruciatingly difficult for them. So you cannot give them a pass. When I was still in the administration, I would say, look, everybody here thinks the Palestinians are too weak to criticize. If they're too weak to criticize, they're too weak to be responsible, they're too weak to have a state.
So we know, obviously, that the two leaders of the two countries, U.S. and Israel, aren't the best of friends, and they have a kind of personality conflict. But are there any areas in the U.S., are there any areas in which the U.S. and Israel have conflicting interests? And I don't mean policy positions. Right. I mean, is there any area at which we really would be at odds in what our ultimate goals were?
The short answer is no. I mean, we have a fundamental convergence of interests. Think about it. Almost exclusively, those who threaten the United States also threaten Israel and vice versa. Look, and then I would say right now there is one potential area where we might have a difference. It has to do with Russia. Right now, the Israelis, for understandable reasons, because of the Russian presence in Syria, are coordinating. They have an open line with the Russians because they want to preserve a kind of freedom of action if it comes to weapons being transferred to Hezbollah. Now, the fact that they talk to the Russians, that's not a problem per se. But Russia now is trying to broaden who it sells gas to. They want to develop the fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. They want these two fields that the Israelis have, one big one called Leviathan. They want to go in and they want to develop it. That's really not in our interest to have the Russians develop that field. And yet, for Israel, they've made no decisions. But it could be in Israel's interest to do it. Because if they allow the Russians to do it, is Hezbollah going to attack those fields? Probably not. If someone else is developing the fields, it might be. From a strategic standpoint, we really don't have an interest in the Russians being the ones who develop that. Now, will the Israelis make this decision? I don't know. But if you ask me if there's one area of potential difference, I would say that's it. What I point out in the book is there have been times when Israel has used force unilaterally that we have felt negatively affects our interests. Now, typically, we've been wrong. So the Reagan administration, suspended delivery of F-16s to Israel because Israel bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. Reagan later on said, gee, we suspended F-16s. Later on, Reagan thought maybe that wasn't such a bad idea after all. Israel, in 2007, attacked Al-Kabar, which was a secret nuclear reactor in Syria. Bob Gates was Secretary of Defense. He actually wanted us to threaten the Israelis, threaten the whole relationship, if they went ahead and did this. It turned out, in the Osirak reactor, the Arabs, when we hit that, no one in the Arab world complained about it. When the Israelis took out the Al-Kabar, no one in the Arab world complained about it. In each case, there was this prediction that this is going to cause a terrible turmoil, a great cost to us in the region. In each case, we read it wrong. But there has been a perception that Israel could act militarily, unilaterally in ways that could hurt us. The historic record suggests that's not the case, but I think that is still an embedded assumption.
So over the course of your 30-year entrenchment in the U.S.-Israel relationship, there have been times, and you mention at least a couple examples in the book, of when something has gone wrong or something's not, or there's a challenge, or there's back-channeling going on, where it has you've either been directly or indirectly accused of dual loyalty. So I want to ask you, as a Jewish person, as someone who cares, how do you reconcile your commitment to the United States, your patriotic commitment to the United States, with your personal love and support for the state of Israel, especially when those two areas come into conflict or tension?
It's true. I mean, during the Obama administration, there were some leaks about me suggesting I was more loyal to Jerusalem than I was to Washington. Obviously the people who leaked that were trying to do damage to me. I have never had in my mind, I've never had what I see as a conflict. I say that because what I proposed, when I pushed something, I pushed it because I believed it was in America's interest. That it might be something that would be good for Israel wasn't a contradiction in my mind. If there were times when I thought the Israelis were right on something and I thought we should support them in that, I didn't have a problem with that either, because I thought it was the right thing to do for both of us. People who opposed me at times opposed me because somehow they tried to suggest that I was putting the Israeli interest before our interests.
But how do you think about it conceptually? You're giving examples, but I kind of want to ask you, how do you think about it philosophically in terms of, I am a Jewish person in my soul, and I love this country, and I am a citizen of this country, and I work for this country, but I also so deeply care about this other country, and, how do I do that, especially when there are moments of tension? How do you think about it, and, how to feel, and...
Well, I think, all right, look, obviously I've experienced that this is a reality, not as an abstraction. In those moments, what's my point of departure? My point of departure is to try to reconcile differences, not to magnify the differences. If I had felt that we were doing something that would damage Israel and I couldn't live with the policy, I would have resigned. At the end of the day, I don't think there's a contradiction. The reason I don't think there's a contradiction is because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Doesn't mean I don't have criticisms of Israeli policies. I do have criticisms of Israeli policies. But you can have a disagreement on something. The U.S. has disagreements with its closest allies. There's no surprise there. There's no shock there. It's part of a given. To reconcile this, to reconcile differences is what you do. When you're in these roles, that's your responsibility. Figure out how you deal with what's the larger interest at stake. The truth is, for all the years that I was in different administrations, one of the core interests that was defined as an American interest in the Middle East was always our commitment to Israel. From the time that I served, actually first in the Carter administration. And the Carter administration was not a big enthusiast for Israel, right? But nonetheless, there was a sense we had a responsibility to Israel's security. And so I don't see, yes, you can have tension. Yes, you can have differences. But I don't see a contradiction.
So we're almost out of time, so I want to ask quickly, I want to just get a quick answer on something, and then I want to ask you one last big question. Okay. So the quick thing I want to say is, could you just say in a few sentences, we always talk about how much the United States support for Israel is, and we obviously feel better about Israel's security in the world knowing that the U.S. has its quote back. Why does it matter? Why does it matter for the United States, this ally? Why does Israel matter to the United States? When we say it's the only democracy in the Middle East, what does that mean? What does that actually? How does that express itself in day-to-day articulations? So just see if you could.
All right, I'll try to do it.
Take a stab, a quick stab.
I'll do it. Let me do it in two ways.
What does the U.S. get out of its relationship?
I understood that's what you're asking. Look, at a technical level. What Israel provides us militarily, you almost couldn't pay for. The armor that protects our tanks and our APCs, who developed it first? The Israelis did. The drone technologies that we use, who developed it first? The Israelis did. We got in the past, Israel would be fighting Soviet doctrine, Soviet weapons. We learned an enormous amount for our own weapons development from the Israeli experiences. Everything was shared, weapons were turned over to us, exploitation of that. So much of what we have done in terms of defense, industrial development, we have actually gotten from the Israelis. So, from a technical standpoint, and not to mention on intelligence, on counterterror, on, in a sense, how you develop after 9/11. Who are we talking to about how to deal with airport security? The Israelis. You go outside of that. Next door in California, as they look at the drought, who are they bringing in as experts? Israelis. Going back to the 1960s, during the Kennedy administration, the Israelis were helping us in Africa. So, in very practical, tangible terms, we get a lot from Israel. But the larger intangible is important as well. When you say democracies, if you have one democracy in the Middle East and that democracy were to disappear, what do you think the future of democracy is worldwide? The point is, there are practical, tangible things we get from Israel. But there's also something, I would say, that's less tangible, but no less important.
Hope.
Yes.
Okay. If you'll stay for 2 more minutes, my last big question is this. I really want to, actually, somebody came up to me and stopped me in the hallway the other day and said, after listening to you the other night, and said, please ask Dennis this. So I promised that I would, and it's a quite good question. So you said the other night that you don't believe, that you believe the world is starting to recognize that the notion they had that Israeli-Palestinian peace was going to impact the broader Middle East in a profound way is starting to disappear. People are starting to realize even if there is a peace, bad stuff's still going to go on in Syria. We're still going to have problems elsewhere in the region. Let's put aside the humanitarian issue of how a large percentage of the Palestinian civilian population is living. Let's put that aside. Aside from the humanitarian issue, why does it matter to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Look, the reason it matters, in my mind, if you're a supporter of Israel, if you believe in Israel, you don't want Israel to become a binational state. I mean, the demographics, in the end, don't lie. You can debate when Israel is no longer a Jewish democratic state. The timing of that can be influenced or can be debated by the statistics, but not the fact of it. Eventually, unless something different is done, Israel will become a binational state. Now, that was not the Zionist dream. The whole point of building a Jewish state in Palestine wasn't to become a binational state. So if you don't have an approach on this issue, even if you can't solve it, look, I don't believe you can solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue today because the Palestinians are too weak, too divided, too dysfunctional to do anything. But you need to take several steps that don't put Israel at risk and yet actually deal with risks that Israel faces. The delegitimization movement worldwide is an existential threat to Israel. Israel becoming a binational state is an existential threat to Israel. So what do you have to do? One, make your settlement policy consistent with a two-state outcome. The Prime Minister of Israel says he's for 2 states for 2 peoples. I believe him, by the way. Probably nobody spent more time with Netanyahu than I have. But if you want 2 states for 2 peoples, then don't build in what would be the Palestinian state. Build within the blocks, don't build outside the blocks. And announce it. Choreograph it first privately, but then announce it and say, our policy is 2 states for 2 peoples. We will not build to the east of the security barrier. We won't build in 92% of territory. There will be no Israeli sovereignty to the east of the security barrier. That's not the final border, but we can't negotiate a final border right now because the Palestinians aren't at the table. The value of that is it immediately begins to say, okay, from this point on, we're not going to become a binational state. We are not the reason there's no movement towards two states. You diffuse the delegitimization issue because basically today BDS can hide behind their focus on settlements and occupation. Nobody knows worldwide that BDS is against two states. Nobody knows it. They have all these supporters in Europe. Nobody knows. There's an international consensus for two states. Nobody knows it. You go to Omar Barghouti, who was the founder of BDS. You look at his principles. There is no Israel. So there's an international consensus for two states, and right now the policy doesn't expose them. So, for me, it is important to focus on what you can do to make sure that Israel doesn't become